Well, I hope that you are as excited about the privilege that we're having to hear from these great men and women of God from across the country as they speak from their professional experience, their life experience, and their knowledge of these topics that are important to all of us that are going to avoid making destructive decisions and build solid foundations for our homes, our families, and for the generations to come. I'm Apostle Tommy Quick, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next guest, and that is Dr. Ojinga Harrison. Dr. Ojinga Harrison, along with his wife, are Christian psychiatrists. Dr. M. Ojinga Harrison is the CEO and clinical director of the Carter Clinic. He is a member of the Christian Medical Dental Association, American Psychiatric Association, and National Medical Association. Dr. Harrison received his BS degree from Jackson State University and his MD from the University of Tennessee School of Medicine. He completed his residency in psychiatry and internal medicine at Duke University. Dr. Harrison is a board-certified psychiatrist. His teaching experience ranges from giving seminars about the Bible and mental health in his local church to training NPs and PAs entering his psychiatric practice. He was a research fellow in 2003 at Duke University's Religion and Health program, which is now the Theology, Medicine, and Culture Initiative. Dr. Harrison and his wife are trained in biblical counseling and sound doctrinal teaching under the leadership of Bishop and First Lady Wooden of the Upper Room Church of God in Christ. Today, Dr. Ojinga is going to talk to us. Dr. Harrison is going to talk to us about the effects of the breakdown of family on mental health. Listen, it's amazing. If you're continuing to watch through, you'll see that most of the ills of society are being related to the state of the family. Most of the problems that we as a society are facing, whether they're behavioral or social or whatever, they stem from families that are not formed and functioning in a biblical way. And today, Dr. Harrison is going to share with us the effects of the breakdown of the family on the thinking, the mental condition, the mental health of people. Dr. Harrison, what a tremendous pleasure and honor it is, sir, to have you to join us today. God bless.
I want to thank you, Apostle Quick, for that generous introduction and for allowing me to be a part of this this presentation, this conference that you're having. The CFAD, the Christian Families Against Destructive Decisions, is a noble and very needed initiative during this time in our history of our country and for our communities, our hurting communities. I am excited about the CFAD because I work in the field of mental health and deal with these challenges of broken families and the consequences of the broken family and hurting marriages all the time. And so anytime someone else is excited about it and has a call to engage this community and the society in this fashion, I'm more than excited to be a participant in that. I want to thank my Bishop Wooden for his leadership and all that he does to address these same types of issues. And I also want to thank my wife. She's always been a blessing to me and an encouragement to me, and also helped me to prepare for this presentation today. So all the good things, and she was her idea, and all the challenges, things you may not like, that's probably all me. All right. Well, my challenge today is to deal with the effects of the breakdown on the family, on the family mental health in particular. And so what I want to provide is an overview of what I hope to accomplish. I would like to paint a story for you that presents and supports the idea that the nuclear family is the basic structural unit in a society, and that the most successful nations utilize it for organizing, educating, and protecting its citizens, in particular its children. Then appreciating that, we want to move on to understanding the nuclear family unit. And I want to presents statistics that show that increasingly a breakdown in the two-parent family in America has contributed to adverse childhood experiences. And these adverse childhood experiences, research has shown, has contributed to many detrimental causes within the community, consequences rather within the community. And finally, I want to give concerned Christians a way to make a difference. The structure of the nuclear family throughout human history, it has represented a building block of society, as mentioned earlier. The nuclear family, the father, the mother, the children, has been seen in early descriptions of human life, as early as you can imagine, even in Genesis with Adam and Eve. The nuclear family has been the primary, although not the only, unit of societal organization, education, and protection for the continuation of the society. Successful countries, each greater than 2,500 years of age, and have had continual statehood, have always been a state, a nation, such as Egypt, China, Greece, Ethiopia, and Georgia, have utilized the nuclear family as a dominant structure for their societies. The extended family, that is the nuclear family plus grandparents or relatives, and in some cultures, these are either an advantage because of the way in which work is done within that society, or a cultural tradition. But these, however, are only an extension of the nuclear family unit. Other structures that have been tried but not widely adapted, such as the communal structure. An example of the communal structure of living, we'll use the Jewish kibbutz. In this structure of a family unit, the children are cared for by caregivers within the commune. These individuals are designated to that task. The children may not see their parents for only maybe 1 or 2 hours a day, 3 to 4 hours a day, and they do not sleep or live with the family, that is, their biological parents. This was popular in Israel at the turn of the century and in the 1900s. And it grew for a few years, but has since begun to diminish. And in fact, those individuals, in particular the women who grew up in that society, chose not to raise their children that way, opting rather for the traditional nuclear family to raise their children, even though that is not the way they were raised. Another example is polyandry, or women with multiple husbands. This is a rare but documented on every continent situation. Most likely this grows out of a distress in the society. Female infanticide, or women who have been taken out of a society because of war, and so there are fewer women in this society, or land scarcity, or reasons that you may see polyandry. But this structure of organizing a family has not grown, and it is not a part of any successful society today. Polygamy, or actually more properly known as polygyny, one man and two women, is very familiar for us in the Christian tradition. It was practiced by the patriarchs. However, since the introduction of Christianity, it has long been criticized, famously by Thomas Aquinas, nearly 8 centuries ago, when he contended that polygamy or polygyny is unjust to wives and to children, creates rival stepchildren, and forces children to compete for attention, food, and shelter, and thus is not preferable. The most successful and most powerful countries in the world have made polygamy illegal. US, China, European countries, Russia. Polygamy is only seen as successful in rural agricultural countries, such as described in the scriptures with the patriarchs. It has been seen, polygamy is seen in successful cultures, but generally only among the ruling class or the wealthy, but not as a rule, a building block for a society. The structure of the American family. Early settlers and Native Americans utilized the nuclear family. We know the Native Americans married and had the nuclear family structure. Although, again, polygamy may have been practiced, it was only practiced amongst the chiefs or the wealthy, but not a consistent family unit that is seen throughout the society. Early European settlers were Christians or Catholics, and of course, we know that they used and supported the nuclear family system. For Africans held as slaves, however, the vast majority were not allowed the nuclear family structure. They were not allowed the nuclear family structure, and if so, it represented only a minority of their arrangements. And this was primarily because selling of slaves away was a way of life for the plantation or the slave owners. The fathers could not operate as fathers, providing protection, ensuring stability, providing sustenance for the family. As a result, mothers or extended family members were, by default, leaders in the home and also leaders in the community. And this begins the culture of fatherlessness that we see in the African American community. The decreasing rates of two-parent families in America has been going on for about the last 80 years. Since 1940, this problem has been going on. And when you look from 1960 to 2016, the percentage of children living with their mothers triples, going from 8% to 23% in that period of time. Also, the number increased of those who live only with their fathers from 1% to 4%. So this is a phenomenon going on throughout America, throughout all cultures, throughout all the races in America. But the impact in the African American family has been worse. The most likely reasons are that the African American family has truly been under assault since arriving in America. The nuclear family structure and traditions were broken during slavery. They were broken. Improvements may and are believed to have occurred after emancipation. That is, the structure of the family reconstituted father, mother, children. And it has been reported that in 1940, it had increased to as high as 85% of African American homes were two-parent homes. However, also in 1940, we know that white families were reported to have 95% of their families, of their children living in two-parent families. So then, it has always been there or has continued to linger, this negative effect of slavery. There's been this separation in white Americans and Black Americans, two-parent households. This problem began to get worse, as previously mentioned. Since 1940, we know that Jim Crow was truly an assault against African American males as well as African American families, but African American males in particular. And it affected their ability to provide food, clothing, and shelter and stability for their family. Further erosion in 1960 came with the unintended consequences of the war on poverty, which discouraged African Americans from being fathers in their homes. This has been documented by E. Franklin Frazier and the Moynihan Report. These scholarly reports and individuals who have written many documents describe the history of the African American family and the challenges that beset it. Additional problems were the feminist movement, which caused African Americans to compete with white women for workforce employment. And finally, erosion occurred with the ending of the Christian values and the constraints imposed by Christian values, with the sexual revolution, and also with the acceptance of divorce becoming more prevalent and less stigmatized in our society, which again increased the likelihood of a single parent family or broken families. So as a result, by 1991, 68% of children, African American children, were born out of wedlock. In 1970, 64% of African Americans were married. But by 2004, only 32% of African Americans were married. And these low marriage rates are thought to believe caused by a lack of male financial stability. They did not have the money. We hear it all the time, even now, because they didn't feel financially able or strong enough, they did not get married. Consequences of the diminishing family structure. It is only in the last 20 years that we have truly been able to appreciate and make the connection with the wide-ranging challenges that we have that come as a result of the broken home. The adverse childhood experiences are a major consequence of the breakdown of the family. And it is really hard to overstate the importance of these adverse childhood experiences. The CDC and Kaiser Permanente collaborated in 1995 through 1997 to look at the effects of psychological trauma on physical and mental health from ages 1 to 17. The trauma was in the form of abuse, physical and sexual emotional abuse, neglect, physical or emotional neglect, and household dysfunction. That is household incarceration, mental illness, substance dependence, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. We know that children who grow up in single-parent homes are at higher risk for all of these problems: abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, substance abuse, domestic violence. 62% of people in America have at least one adverse childhood event, and 16% have 4 or more adverse childhood events. Adverse childhood events of 4 or more are correlated with many negative health outcomes. African American communities are 76% greater likelihood of having these adverse childhood events versus the majority population. Adverse childhood experiences are not only correlated with mental health conditions, for example, depression, anxiety, but adverse childhood events also increase the likelihood of physical health consequences. The biological consequences of these adverse childhood events are remarkable. ACEs, or adverse childhood events, are correlated highly with the 9 out of 10 most common causes of death in America. This includes cancer and heart disease. 9 out of 10 are correlated with adverse childhood experiences. The mechanisms of injury involve stress, in particular toxic stress. You see on the chart, we have samples of these adverse childhood experiences or events. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional neglect, a family member who's depressed or being diagnosed with mental illness, witnessing a mother being abused, losing a parent, a family member, or having a family member in prison. These stressors in the life of a child will precipitate stress response. This stress response is also known as a fight or flight response. During stressors, your body produces large amounts of cortisol or adrenaline. Prolonged elevations of these hormones will cause dysregulation or persistent inflammatory states. Your body is always experiencing this chronic inflammation. Inflammation is what happens when you get a bee sting. It swells up, or you injure yourself. In certain situations, it's helpful, but on a short period of time. But if your whole body is chronically experiencing this inflammatory response, it's a tremendous negative. The hormones involved in this response begin to damage the developing brain. This kind of prolonged elevation of stress hormones disrupts the brain architecture development and also affects other organ systems. It increases the risk for stress-related diseases and cognitive impairment well into adulthood. The medical consequences of adverse childhood events or experiences are childhood sleep disruption, pneumonia, asthma, skin diseases, atopic dermatitis, for example, somatic complaints, physical complaints such as headaches or stomach aches. It increases the risk of high-risk behavior, resulting in STDs and pregnancy. For adults, these medical consequences could include cancer, diabetes, COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, strokes, and chronic pain. In fact, the life expectancy of an individual with 6 or more adverse childhood experiences is 19 years less than a person with no adverse childhood experiences. 19 years less. The psychological consequences of these adverse childhood experiences would involve children suffering arrested character development, lower self-esteem, and problems with self-image. These broken families have been demonstrated to have higher rates of homosexuality, and homosexuals are more likely to come from homes where there is an antagonistic relationship between the same-sex parent. So men who identify as homosexual are much more likely to have an antagonistic or no relationship with their father, and women are more likely to have a negative self-appraisal, a negative appraisal of their mothers, or negative relationship with their mothers. Children and adults with adverse childhood experiences will have an increased risk for major depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance use, suicidal thinking and impulsive control behaviors, and additionally, cognitive impairment. And again, children with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences are 16 times more likely to commit suicide. 16 times more likely to commit suicide. The 2-parent family is protective. The 2-parent healthy families are protective, even for fathers who may not be in the home. Studies have shown that time the father spends has a positive correlation with psychological well-being. It includes less depression, less anxiety. Additionally, emotional support from the father is related to fewer delinquency problems and lower marijuana use. What are the social consequences of the breakdown in our family? When communities are robbed from the nuclear family and don't have 2 parents playing a supportive and protecting role, the brokenness continues to successive generations. The development of unhealthy subculture is a consequence. In an unhealthy subculture that exists within the African American community, unhealthy role models develop. Mothers who prefer relationships without male leadership, who prefer to operate their families without a man in the home. They even shun male leadership for cultural reasons and then later for financial reasons. Fathers who have only seen female leadership affects their ability to be leaders. The gangster rapper, the sports figure are the only celebrated male role models in the culture. I like sports like most guys, but the problem is you don't see LeBron James helping with math homework in your house. You don't see Michael Jordan teaching reading You don't see them caring for families as day in, day out as a model for young African American males. The other social consequences is that music that has been perpetuated in the culture, it glorifies and instructs in the worst aspects of this social subculture. Drug use and violence and uncommitted relationships are celebrated in the music. We have weakened social networks. So while the extended family can come in and be a support, the reality is that in these extended families, their ability to actually assist the troubled family is limited because they too are suffering from the same lack of physical and mental health, lack of financial support, lack of education, and lack of moral health. The challenges with the financial capacity are well known. 9.7% of African Americans live in poverty, but 44% of the African Americans are headed by 44% of single parent homes for African Americans live in poverty. So single parenthood greatly increases the likelihood that a child will grow up in an impoverished environment. The cost of these social stressors necessitate governmental responses. I'm a part of the governmental response to the challenges for mental health. But these responses are an inadequate attempt to address the problem. Treatment centers and drug counselors are necessary for the high levels of addiction that is seen within the community. In 2007, $14 billion were spent on these types of drug rehab facilities and drug treatment. The reality is that was before the opiate epidemic. So those numbers are significantly higher now. Other consequences of this subculture is normalizing criminal behavior. Drug dealing, drug pushing, drug selling is an acceptable form of employment, results in mass incarceration. The number of violent crimes that are involved, again, more involvement with the criminal justice system. The estimated cost of that is $113 billion. And not to mention poverty and related resources such as welfare programs, food stamps, child care, which is required for single parent families. These are important and necessary programs, but in an epidemic of the breakdown of the family, the costs are exponential. That is not to mention the consequences of the adverse childhood experiences and the long mental health and physical health consequences that come along with the years of consequences that occur. There are millions and millions of lost years of contributions to American society has to also be considered in the cost that are related to the breakdown of the family. What are the spiritual consequences of this breakdown? The first I would name is vulnerability. 1 Peter 5:8. Satan goes around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Families without both parents are more vulnerable to adverse childhood experiences, and that may involve changing of boyfriends is a frequent example that will increase the likelihood of abuse, of neglect of a child. Spiritual blindness is a consequence. The one example of this would be the Black Lives Matter movement that attempts to address the problems in the African American community without valuing the role of the male in our society, in our homes. This is spiritual blindness. Romans 1:21 said, although they knew God, they neither glorified him nor gave thanks, but rather became futile in their thinking and darkened in their foolish hearts. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. It is foolish to try to solve these types of problems without including the principal part of the problem, fatherlessness in our society, and not including the father in the solution. The society or the culture of death that exists in many of our inner cities. African Americans suffered in 2019 7,400 murders. This number has increased every year since 2014. And we all know the tragedy of this summer in Chicago, where they've had more than 500 murders in only the first 6 months of the year. In a typical year, their total murder rate, although astronomical at 500 or 600, this year is 600 already. I'm sorry, it's 500 already, and it's only half of the year. The spiritual consequence that's happening in our community is apathy. It's callousness of heart. Because where's the outrage? It has become normal, and that is the problem. Our former president, Obama, is from Chicago and did nothing. But there's no outrage. Our hearts have become callous. It has become normal. This is a spiritual consequence. Generational problems of fatherlessness. These are generational problems. In Numbers 14 and 18, it mentions that the sins of the fathers visit the children to the third and the fourth generations. Maybe that's what's going on. In Malachi 4 and 6, it said that he would send a prophet, and he would turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest I come and spite the earth with a curse. Is this a spiritual consequence? Is this the problem? Another spiritual consequence is the culture, the unholy culture. The crime culture has replaced the moral or holy culture. And this is because evil communication corrupts good manners. The gangster rap music is the loudest and most seductive worldview that our African Americans experience. If you can acknowledge that Satan was God's minister of music before he fell, you wouldn't be surprised if he used music as his most powerful and effective weapon. From songs that teach you how to take over a neighborhood and sell drugs, and other songs that instruct you how to conduct a drive-by shooting, to songs that teach kids how to actually make crack rock cocaine, all glorifying and sensationalizing a culture of drug use, gang killings, and promiscuity, a culture of death, a culture of crime. It has indeed changed our culture for the worst. Tupac and Jay-Z are this generation's MLK. And there's a consequence for that, and we see it. Moving the old landmarks is another spiritual consequence. Psalms 11 and 3, if the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Slavery redefined fatherhood for the African American community. The African American subculture has redefined the family structure. The federal government has redefined marriage. These are all consequences of a spiritual decline in our culture. Concerned Christians can make a difference. What are some solutions? The nuclear family is God's idea. Not that other family structures are not important or possible or even successful. I'm a product of a single family home, of a broken family. So we know the individuals who come out of this community can be successful. So the goal is not to shame, because shame has no redemptive or constructive power. There's no power, no constructive power in shame. People, when they're shamed, they run away, like Adam and Eve. But our goal is to make the next generation better than the last generation. We can do this through teaching and preaching and inspiring others to reach the mark, the gold standard of the nuclear family, because it works. And we must do this in order to change the culture that we are living in now. And not settle for what it is and try to re-understand ourselves in light of what it is and call that normal, but to preach and to teach and to encourage and to model what ought to be. Additionally, many studies have shown that religiosity and religious coping decreases depression, it decreases anxiety, it decreases cardiovascular disease, it increases survivability, that is life expectancy. And this process is mediated through the same biochemical mechanisms, the immune system and the neuroendocrine system that I mentioned earlier, that were the cause for these many problems that are created by adverse childhood experiences. So we should encourage religious coping and religious strategies because it works. They work. We should support the nuclear family through policies. It was through policies that the nuclear family was broken, or made worse at least, with the governmental push in the social welfare programs. Why not push for incentives for the two-parent family structure? So we know it's the best. We know it works. We should utilize our governmental organizations and individuals within the government to incentivize the two-parent family structure. Put the money where their mouth is. Put the money where the problem is. And finally, address the adverse childhood experiences through benevolent childhood experiences. Research has shown that benevolent childhood experiences or positive childhood experiences will counteract the adverse childhood experiences. That teacher, that preacher, that football coach that nurtured you, that encouraged you, that believed in you, that inspired you, that's an example of a positive or benevolent childhood experience. Children who have had adverse childhood experiences, but also experienced or had a wealth of positive childhood experiences, had much better mental health and physical health outcomes. That is my encouragement to all of you, that we be more a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. Thank you.